welcome everyone. I'm Claire Cheney. I'm the founder of Curio, and really happy. Oh, there's Eleanor joining. Really happy that you all have signed up for our virtual granola class today with the wonderful Susan Turner, and really wonderful to see many of the familiar faces. So thank you so much for being regular class participants and for supporting Curio. It really means a lot. So a little intro to Susan. Susan has been on the Curio team since 2017?
No, 16, but officially 17.
Okay, I knew I needed a little time reference.
But in 16, I was just like fiddling and diddling.
Well, Susan came on board at Curio simply to help me out. Because we were friends before that, friends and colleagues from working in the restaurant and farm world before that, and we just kept wanting to hang out, and it was really great to have her come and give me some graphics support early on in the Curio days, but she quickly became an integral member of the team and is now full-time at Curio as our graphics and events manager. So Susan is very special. You all are really in for a treat today and for any future classes she teaches. She has a wonderful knowledge of ingredients and dedication to testing recipes. These granola and bar recipes have been thoroughly tested and tweaked to taste super good and to be really easy to make for you in the kitchen at home. And as we all know, it's beginning to be the wonderful cool autumn season, at least here in New England. And that means we can turn our ovens on again and really enjoy embracing our spices. So the other thing that I just want to note before we get started is the fact that I'm really proud of Susan for including a pumpkin recipe because in the food world in particular, the sort of processed food world, the pumpkin spice phenomena is everywhere, and you know, we don't really know what that means. What is pumpkin spice? Pumpkin spice got shortened, that phrase got shortened from pumpkin pie spice. So it's sort of the pumpkin pie spice flavor profile that becomes a very familiar nostalgic flavor this time of year, such that you even see toothpaste flavored with.
But you'll notice that I made the name of the recipe spiced pumpkin because I just couldn't go there.
I know, it's candy spice pumpkin jam.
Yeah.
So I will pop in a little bit here and there during the class to talk a bit about the spices, but really this is Susan's show. So Susan, I'm going to turn it over to you and all things granola. So thanks everyone.
Okay. So we, as per usual, those of you who've been in one of the classes before, will ask you to mute yourselves. During the class, we'll have a live Q&A at the end of the class. And in the meantime, there's a little chat feature on your, it's along the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, you'll get a window along the side. And in there, you can just type in a question. Claire will answer it or she'll feed it to me. And it seems to work pretty well, but it's a little less chaotic than if everyone's, unfortunately I miss it because when we had in-person classes at the shop, that's one of the joys is just that back and forth. But with the video, it makes it a little bit more difficult for everyone to understand what's going on. So granola, I thought I love making granola, and one of the reasons I do is it's one of those things in all our lives. We have so many balls in the air all the time, projects that are ongoing, that never seem to end, things that need attending to. And sometimes it's really nice to have a project that's not too complicated. You start and you finish and you've got something done, and it's tangible and it's delicious and it doesn't take too long. And granola is all those things for me. I also love it because I grew up eating it. I grew up in a vegetarian household in Dayton, Ohio, in the 60s and 70s. My parents were far from hippies. They were, in fact, very religious. And so their dietary choices tied into their view of their physical selves in a spiritual world. Um, so, but I did grow up eating things like granola. My mother made granola routinely, giant batches of it. Um, and back then, health food was really pretty brown. And I'd say mom's granola is delicious, but it's pretty much down the line what you'd expect, and kind of like what old school granola with wheat germ, oat bran, molasses, things like that. What's that, Claire? Oh, I thought Claire said something to me,
I
sorry.
think you might be hearing, my door keeps blowing open, so let me just try and secure it, because you might be hearing yourself. Hold on.
Oh, okay. Um, I'll give you a little bit of history on granola, like where did it come from? So it too came from the mid 19th century, sort of Civil War and post-Civil War. There were huge movements. It's not unlike today in spiritual seeking, in health, and especially sort of prescriptions for health, things that if you do this, you will get these results. That's when graham flour was invented, as in graham crackers. So it was trying to look at it. They weren't all wrong, but maybe it was a little bit kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like they were fanatics a bit. If you've ever seen the movie Road to Wellville, there's a connection with Kellogg's as well. So in the early 1860s, a guy named James Jackson invented a breakfast cereal to get people away from eating so much fried food and meat, especially at breakfast. And this was especially true as people were still eating like they were on the farm, but now they're in cities and suburbs, and they're just, we're having a lot of health issues. Dyspepsia, I think, was one of the things. So he came up with something that he called granola. It's very different from what we think of as granola. It was a flour based, so it was whole grain flours mixed with water. It's really kind of like a cracker or hardtack. So you mixed this up, you baked it off, you broke it up, you baked it again, you broke it up further, and you baked it again. And to eat this stuff, you actually had to kind of soak it overnight. This went along with ideas about how many times you should chew your food before swallowing it in order to have the best digestion. And there were a lot of, they got an A for trying, but there were a lot of crazy ideas. Dr. Kellogg, who is one of in the family, the people that started Kellogg's Foods, he had a sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. This is where it ties into my family because this was a Seventh-day Adventist institution. So there was a whole emphasis on health. And he came up with his own version of granola. And Mr. Jackson actually sued him over trademark infringement. So they changed the name to granola. And then from there, you can see how those early roots, Post was in on that, Kellogg's was in on that. So cold cereal sort of came out of that movement. The one that was like a wheat paste that was dried, then that became like cornflakes. You could do other flours, you could run it through a flaking mill, which was newly invented, and cornflakes became a thing, and they were a health food starting out. Moving on, it sort of faded from view except for the very, very resolute and very righteous. And then in the 50s, it kind of had a revival, and that is with homesteading and back to the land and organic gardening. And again, it's still pretty brown, but it begins to resemble what we think of as it's using rolled grains and things like that, but probably not as fun as what we're going to do. Then in the 60s, there was a guy, kind of a hippie guy. He moved around the country. He sold his recipe, had a real good recipe for granola. It included nuts, it included fruits. And he moved from place to place and just sold different people his same recipe, made a lot of money. His name was Leighton Gentry, but he was known as Johnny Granola Seed, honestly. So at that point, it begins to be embraced by counterculture, and then starts to move into mainstream a bit. You know, there were bakeries, there were things like that where people got exposed to it. And then it was in the 70s that Pet Foods actually recognized that this was a trend and brought a commercial granola product to supermarkets. And from there, the rest is history. And now we've kind of come back to, I mean, there's certainly a lot of commercial granolas out there, but there's also a real emphasis on beautiful granolas made by small bakeries or artisanal producers. And that's sort of where we are with what we're doing tonight, because it's such a simple thing to make. It's a perfect canvas for being really creative with flavor. So you have some basic flavors and basic components. You usually have a rolled grain. Most of the time I use oats. If folks are gluten-free oats are available, as well as you can combine different rolled grains. Like you could put some rolled wheat with this, not for you gluten-free folks, but you could put some rolled wheat. You can even use some rolled rye, but I would be careful with the rye, not using too much of it because it's a very, very strong flavor. But you can start building flavors even with the basic components, just the grain, just the toasty grains. Then the fat that you use, the sweetener that you use, which nuts and seeds that you use, that's all creative. And you can use that to play around with flavor combinations. And then there's the spices. Typically, I think people think of granola as being a sort of a cinnamon spice. And that's lovely, but you can take it in another direction, which is what we're going to do here. So what I think I'll do is just show you how I put this together real quickly, and then how I stir it for baking, and how to turn the granola. I have some already pre-made over there in the pan, so I can show you a couple of technical things. So I've got in my bowl, if you've got the recipe with you, you can see I've got 4 cups of old-fashioned rolled oats. So these are fairly thick. This is not the quick cooking oats. You can use quick cooking oats, but the texture is not going to be as crunchy or as nice because the quick cooking oats are par cooked and then dried again, which is how they cook more quickly. So into this bowl, we're going to put all our dry ingredients, which includes unsweetened coconut. This is, I think, key that it's unsweetened, both because it doesn't, some sweetened coconut to me tastes a little chemically. And the other thing about this is that this just tastes more coconutty. I am using what's called, this is Trader Joe's, and it's a flaked coconut, so it's in the long strands. Some brands call this shredded. Some brands shredded, like Bob's Red Mill shredded, is much finer than this. It's more, but you can use any cut that you like. You could use flakes, you can use any, just it's a textural preference. So that's another thing you can build creatively as you go along, is what textures are you bringing to this. So the, the coconut goes in. In this case, I'm using almonds, and the almonds are going right in with the dry ingredients. There are some instances with other nuts where you would add the nuts at a later point in the process because too long in the oven and they would burn. Pecans are an example of that. Or we have another granola that the recipe's online. It's fig and bay leaf. And there we used hazelnuts because they have this sort of really earthy, nutty, but they have a little bitterness, and that gives it a, that puts it in line with the bay. It's just a really, really nice combination. And those you're going to toast before so that you can get the skins off, so you don't want to run them through the oven and have them burn. But here I've got sliced almonds, just a bag of sliced almonds. The recipe calls for 2 cups, 8 ounces. And again, thank you, Trader Joe's. That's exactly what they have. So I just put the whole bag in here. And honestly, Trader Joe's and your grocery store, Bob's Red Mill products, between the two, you're going to be able to come up with a lot of what you need at a really good and reasonable price. Locally, for local folks, we have a Market Basket chain here. It's one of our grocery chains. They have a really nice selection of seeds and nuts, and they have organic, for example, they have organic sunflower, organic pepitas, and dried fruits. So that's another sort of budget-friendly place and easy. You know, if you're already there for your grocery, you can have this stuff in your pantry. A lot of these ingredients I just keep in my freezer. Nuts, for example, so that they don't go rancid, and so that I have them on hand when I have that urge or when I need to accomplish something and make some granola. We're also going to add some sesame seeds. These are unhulled or whole sesame, which is what we sell at the shop. And I prefer using them in many cases, not all cases, have a more robust flavor. The ones that are hulled are obviously more delicate, and they would be more prone to burn. These are going to be safer in this. We're going to add just a little sugar. It's not our primary sweetener, but I'm adding a little sugar, in this case brown sugar, because I want the caramely taste. But in all my granola recipes, I have a tiny bit of sugar, and the reason being is that it helps it crisp. It helps it hold together. You know, as the sugar changes with the heat of the oven, it helps make those nice clumps that I absolutely love. When you get, you know, you get some bits and then you get a clump of granola. I really love that. So the sugar helps to do that. In this case, the brown sugar is going to be adding a little bit of molassesy flavor, a little caramely flavor, which is really nice against the brighter spices that we're using. And salt is the other thing that's really important. Don't undersalt the granola, because the salt really does help the flavors come together. So I'm using 1 teaspoon of sea salt. If you use kosher salt, you might make it up to 1 1/4 teaspoon, because kosher salt is a little, by volume, a little less salty tasting than sea salt. So now I want to talk to you about spices. And what I have here is, I've already ground these just so that we can move through this fairly quickly. I have a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon. So here, cinnamon is not really my primary flavor. I'm really just using it as a complement to the other spices. The cardamom that I'm using here, and I'll show you a couple things on grinding cardamom. Cardamom is really, I can't urge you enough to please, please, please grind it to order. Grind it when you need it. Because it is quite oily, and its aroma, the complexity of its aroma evaporates very, very quickly. So these are those spices.
I will also say, from a value perspective, that cardamom is the 3rd most expensive spice in the world. So if you can avoid buying ground cardamom at all costs, you will actually end up saving money, because when you buy ground cardamom, it usually comes in a big jar. Not from us, we do sell it in a tiny jar that you could stick in your freezer, but you won't be able to use it quick enough such that you'll get that beautiful complex flavor that Susan is talking about. So buying the seeds and grinding them in a mortar and pestle, or the nifty device that Susan will show you, is your best bet.
Yeah. And they're super easy to grind. Cardamom is a spice that I just adore. It has a lemony, it's just uplifting to me. It's very clean smelling, and you'll use it in any kind of Scandinavian cooking. You use it in Indian cooking. You'll use it in the Middle East. Any Middle Eastern recipes, you'll often run into cardamom. Indian, I already said that. But it's a wonderful spice, and it's a wonderful baking spice. So ours comes in packets like this, or jars, and we sell the pods and the seeds. So if you want to be a good citizen and grind it fresh, but you also don't want to have to crack the pods and pick the seeds out of the pods every time, we have the solution, and that is these cardamom seeds. So they're hulled already. So it's the seeds that come out of the pod, already out of the pod for you. And that's what I buy. And I keep this bag in my freezer just to preserve, because I don't use the whole bag all the time. So I just feel like it extends the life a little bit. And the only thing there is when you take the bag out of the freezer to refill your grinder or to use the seeds, you want to measure what you need and get it back in the freezer so that you don't get a lot of condensation going on, which would get the spice wet and make it not be good as long. So the one thing that I would say that I use on a day-to-day basis for grinding cardamom is this thing from Microplane. So it almost looks like a pepper mill, but it just has an interior cavity, and then it's almost like a pestle that goes down in, it slots in. On the bottom is one of the Microplane's little super duper graters. So it only does one fineness or coarseness. There's no adjusting this the way you could a pepper mill. You could also use a pepper mill if you wanted to dedicate one to other spices. I love cardamom in my oatmeal and maybe on a latte or something like that. So I keep this with a little bit of cardamom seed in it by my stove, and then I have my big supply in the freezer. But with this thing, all you do is you turn the top, and I don't know if you can see that, but you get a nice fine powder. You can also use a spice grinder like this, which I'm going to show you for the malab. But for a small amount, the spice grinder is not going to be as effective because there's not enough volume in there. Mm-hmm. So the main magic spice in this granola is called malab. And I'll show it to you. It comes in a jar like this. It's from the Middle East, and Claire can confirm where this little shrub grows. It's in the cherry family, a cherry that's called St. Lucie. And it looks like this. It looks very much like a cherry pit. But what this is actually the inside of the cherry pit. So the way it's kind of built like an almond, which is also its cousin. All of those are in the rose family: almonds, stone fruit, this cherry, malab. So we're gonna, this spice is used throughout the Middle East. It's used in Greece. It's very often used in celebratory baking, particularly for religious holidays. There's nothing like it. It is a subtle flavor, but it's there. And it has hints of cherry. It has hints of almond. It's nutty, it's warm. I can't think of, Claire, can you think of any other?
No, I think you nailed it. I think that it also has those floral characteristics. And so you can sort of picture a cherry tree in bloom and kind of get the sensation that the malab gives you. And it also should be noted that if you can just bite one and eat it, you'll notice all those flavor points, but what you'll also notice is that it's very bitter. Yeah. So that is particularly why it's used predominantly in baking, is because it needs to be with something sweet in order to balance that bitterness. So in granola, it's fabulous. In a cookie or a sweet bread, it's really, really wonderful.
Right. So that's what I was just going to talk about, the bitterness too, which is when you see malab in a recipe, follow the recipe for the amount until you get used to using it. You're going to love the aroma. You're going to be tempted to put another half teaspoon in. Don't, because that bitterness, it plays nice until it doesn't. It's kind of like a cat. And yeah, so you want to, in this case, we've got a teaspoon. It's plenty for this volume, but I wouldn't go more because you might start getting the bitter. Yeah, the bitter flavors in the background work. The bitter flavors coming forward are unpleasant. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to put this in my spice grinder. This is really a little bit too little to do real well in a spice grinder, but I'm just wanted to just show you grinding in a spice grinder. So you kind of have to shake it around. I wish you could smell this smell. So if you're curious, this spice grinder, Amazon, I hate to say, you can get an inexpensive spice grinder for under 20 bucks that doesn't have a removable cup. I really like the ones with the removable cup because you can wash this really easily, whereas and then use it for multiple spices. This one came with a couple of cups. So if you're interested in an electric one, you can email me and I'll give you the brands that we use in the shop, because I like the ones in the shop better than the ones I got myself.
Nancy asked, what about a mortar and pestle? And
oh, absolutely, it'll go real quick.
Yeah,
almost equally quick in a mortar and pestle.
I'd say for both that and the cardamom, you can do that.
Absolutely, you could do them almost together. And again, you're going to want to start with a firm but not too fast downward motion in the mortar and pestle until you get everything crushed, and then you can start going around to refine your how powdery it is. So this is what it looks like when it's ground, and I wish I had a smell-o-rama because it just smells so nice. We sell that in really relatively small jars because it's really nut-like. It has a very high fat content, therefore it goes rancid really quickly. So when you get it, you're going to want to keep it in your fridge, which it will keep for quite a long time. And because it's a seed, before you grind it, you can easily keep this jar for a year. If it was ground, it is going to lose its savor really quickly, and it could possibly go rancid. So it's this too is a spice you want to grind on demand. Excuse me. So those are your dry ingredients, and we're just gonna mix those up. And what I'm using here, I like working in this is even bigger bowl than I usually use that Claire had, which is just great. But I like using a big wide open bowl because I can really move around really easily. You'll see it for the bars. I brought a metal one from home. The metal ones aren't super expensive. Restaurant supplies, great place to get them. And the tool that I'm using is called a bowl scraper. This is from Professional Baking, but you should have it in your kitchen, and get two because it costs like $1. As you can see, it's just really easy to go in and toss things around. It's also really easy to scrape out. It's great for anything, bread making, anything. I'm just going to pause and take a sip of water because I swallowed the wrong way, and I'm going to keep coughing if I'm not careful. Another thing I wanted to mention, and I'll mention this again when we make the bars, but I wanted to mention, when you grind your cardamom seed, grind a little extra and do a little experiment for yourself. Keep that little bit extra just in a little bowl or plate on your counter, and smell it right when you grind it. And you're going to get, it's just vibrant. And you get lemony, and you get floral, and it's just a vibrant, it's like alive, the smell. Smell it after an hour. It's still pretty vibrant. Smell it after 2 hours. It's really nice, but some of those top notes are gone. So when you grind it to order, and then we're now mixing in fats and things that sort of capture those volatile oils and spread them through the dish, you'll see why with certain spices especially, it's important to grind them when you need them. So one is cardamom, and malib is another, and nutmeg, which we'll use in the next recipe, is another. What I have here is 3/4 cup of honey, and how much? A half a cup of a neutral oil. In this case, I'm using avocado oil. Canola is fine, safflower, whichever one you like. I love avocado oil, except there's one that's from France and in a tin can that I hate. It just tastes bad. Or at least the can I got tasted horrible. Generally, it's very neutral, but it's buttery. It's not doesn't feel heavy in your mouth. So I use it a lot. Grapeseed oil, you could also use, you just want a very neutral oil in this case. In other granola recipes, oils are a way to add flavor. Like I have granola that I make that I use olive oil in because I want that extra sort of vegetal flavor that it gives. So don't forget that your fats can be part of your flavor profile, as can be your liquid sweetener. So here I'm using honey. I think we have a vegan participant tonight. So if you didn't want to use honey, you could use brown rice syrup. You could use agave or a combination. But you want to taste those because they have maybe a little bit stronger taste. So you may not use quite as much. You could replace a little bit of the sweetener with a little bit of water, use a little bit more, tiny bit more sugar. So you can play around with it. But all those things add flavor. You could use some molasses. My mother used to use barley malt as one part of the sweetener of hers, which gave it, you know, just like it sounds, a nice malted flavor. The key thing is put your oil in first, then your honey, and you'll thank me later because the honey then will slip right out of your container. The other thing you want to do is warm it gently. And I'm just going to put it here in the microwave for 30 seconds, 45 seconds. So it's not cooking the honey. It's just warming it. Because it's going to be more liquidy. That's going to make it much more easy to, it's going to combine much more easily.
Susan, we had a question earlier from Vanya who asked, because you were talking about the sugar used for crisping, and I know there's also the liquid sweetener. She asked what's sort of the minimum amount of sweetener that you can use in a recipe like this?
If you should do it to taste. You need moisture to bring it together, and then the whole baking process is chasing the moisture out and giving the ingredients time to toast. You can use a little bit of water. You can use you could use some fruit juice. You'll see how wet this is. You just don't want it to be more. The more wet it is, the longer it's going to take to dry out and get crisp. The other thing, if you don't want to use sugar, is you could use some egg white as part of your moisture. That will help, you know, just whisk it till it's frothy so it's not stringy anymore. Use 1 egg white in this recipe, maybe replacing some of the honey by volume. And that's going to give you, you know, replace the moisture that you lost by taking the honey away. And it has a crisping feature and a clumping feature. So our oil and honey are just barely warmed, and they're going to be nice and liquidy, and you just pour them in. And as you can probably see, the honey is coming right out of my cup. I'm not having to go in there with a spoon and get that honey out. It's flowing right out, and it would do it even more dramatically. I had it not been sitting together with the oil for such, you know, I prepped it before class. So this is another area where I really love this. You can use a spatula, you can use a spoon. There's, you know, don't make this more complicated, but you can see why I love this. It makes it really easy to toss all the ingredients. And what we're doing here is just trying to get everything evenly moistened, making sure that there's no excess liquid pooling in the bottom, that it's all clinging to the dry ingredients that we have here. And while I'm doing this, I might tell you that there's some unusual grains that you can add into granolas and seeds that are wonderful. But sometimes I add quinoa, just dry quinoa, not cooked. And it is crunchy, and it adds, you know, quite a bit of protein. My mother used to add soy flour. Like I said, hers was pretty hardcore health food. She used to add some soy flour in this to, again, increase protein content. You could put poppy seeds, you can put sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, whatever your heart desires, and then just always think about the flavor combinations. So we've given you this recipe, and then there's 2 more in the printouts. That fig and bay version is on our website, and those will be good places for you to start. So here I'm going to use a rimmed baking sheet, and the rimmed baking sheet is greased, and grease it really well. Make sure you get the sides because you don't want the granola sticking there as it bakes. So you just, on the sheet it goes. And then you're just gonna, it fills this sheet exactly. In, you know, professional kitchens, and some recipes you may see it referred to as a half sheet, but it's basically 18 by, no. It is 9 by like, I'd have to measure it. Oh my God.
Suze, did you grease the pan with baking spray or?
You can use anything. You just want to make sure baking spray works really well. I actually just use coconut oil because I had it handy. And when I do that, I just use, it's this brush that I use, which you can just basically get at the hardware store and pay $1.50 for. And they can go in the dishwasher. I wash them out by hand with soap and water, and sometimes I put them in the dishwasher. They last a long time. They're made with boar bristle. So you just want to smooth it out. You're not really packing it in the pan. You're just making a nice even layer. And then what I want to show you here, this would go in the oven and it would bake in 10-minute increments. When you need to stir it every 10 minutes. And to stir it, I want to show you how to do that. And I also want to tell you what advantage it is to open the oven and take this out. A, it's much easier to stir on your counter than it is like leaning over the oven. But B, just opening the oven briefly to take this out and then shutting it, it lets moisture out of the oven without having the temperature change radically. So let's pretend this has been baking for 10 minutes and I've taken it out after my first 10 minutes. I want to mix it together so that what's on the bottom, you know, everything gets browned throughout. So what I do is I just scoop it to the middle like this. I just use a sturdy spoon. You could use a spatula, anything you like. I kind of turn it a bit like this. And this will be more obvious because the next time, after the next 10 minutes, the top layer is going to start being a little bit golden, and you want to avoid, if you left it just in one layer and baked it the whole time, the top would burn and the bottom wouldn't be done. So you definitely want to mix it through, and then you spread it out again and put it back in the oven for 10 minutes. It takes, I usually do, it takes about 40 minutes to test. It's not going to seem crisp per se when you take it out, even when it's beautifully browned, because we've sweetened with honey. But it will crisp as it cools. So if you're like on your third turn, you could take a little piece out and set it on the counter, let it cool, and see how crisp you are. If you're all the way dark, you've let a piece cool and you're still thinking, I'd like it a little crispier, turn the oven off and put this back in as with the oven off and the door slightly ajar, so you just get rid of some more moisture. You may really find that if you substitute some water in here, you may have to do a little bit extra on the drying. The final step of this, and in this case, in some cases, you can put fruit right in with the granola when it bakes, but in this case, I'm using sour cherries. And so there's a couple things I want to show you. So this is how the granola looks when it's done. You can see how nice and brown it is. And we're going to pretend this is piping hot instead of having been done a while ago. And what I like to do after you've let it cool for about 5 minutes is you're going to go underneath with a spatula. And this is really now sticking to the pan because this was made a few hours ago. And you're just going to take the spatula and turn large pieces over like that. And the reason is you're going to let the residual moisture is going to evaporate from the bottom. So you want to turn the granola as it cools. I like big chunks, so I try to do this so I have chunks, and then it, you know, it breaks up, but I still have some of those nice big crunchy pieces. And at this point, when you've turned everything over, you're going to add 2 cups of sour cherries, which are chopped. They're just roughly chopped, just so they're not quite as huge as they are. Trader Joe's is a great source for dried sour cherries. And then folks in the Midwest, of course, Wisconsin is cherry heaven.
Susie, do you want to use the overhead for this part? Just
Sure.
for you to see.
Yeah. So, so can you see a little bit? So you're just gonna, you will have turned it over. You'll have big shards. You're letting it cool. You can put the cherries on there, and then when you bag it up or put it in a jar, you can, you know, the cherries will mix through, and that's it. So when it's done, the cherries are mixed through, and you've got pieces and you've got little bits, and it's a thing of beauty.
Yum, that looks so good.
Yeah. So I kind of rambled on there a bit. So I'm going to move very quickly. Does anybody have questions on the granola? Pretty simple, huh? Okay.
Marvelous.
So I'm going to move on to the granola bars. And in this case, we are, first I'm going to show you the pans that you can use to bake these and talk to you a little bit about ingredients. So you can either use a 9x13 cake pan. Make sure it's decently heavy. Don't use the lightest, crappiest one. I got this at TJ Maxx or something, and it's pretty nice heavy steel. Or you can use what's called a quarter sheet pan, which is the same size, 9x13. So that's the size of the half sheet. It's 9x26. So this is 9x13. I like using this little guy. These are easy to find. Again, TJ Maxx, certainly online, certainly Restaurant Supply or Good Kitchen Supply store is going to sell both the larger, the half sheet, and it's going to sell this, what's called a quarter sheet in commercial world. So here again, we're going to grease the pan, and I'll just show you that. I put maybe, that's maybe a couple of teaspoons. I just use my brush again. You could use baking spray. You just want to make sure that really what you're greasing here is the sides, because I'm going to line this with a piece of parchment paper, but not the sides. So you don't want the sides to stick. And the grease just helps the parchment paper stay in place. This just happens to fit my parchment perfectly. And I want a couple of sides up like that, because I'm going to use those as handles later on. So now my pan is prepared, and I can just set that aside. So for pumpkin bars, they get a little bit wetter. We need an ingredient in there, ingredients that help them stick together. I'm going to pack it into the pan so that we get, this is a crunchy granola bar, so you get that, the bar thing. And then in the recipes we're giving you also a recipe for a chewy, it's called a power bar, but it's like a granola bar that's rose scented. It's Claire's recipe. That's really a nice one. One of the things that will help this stick together, here I have 3 cups of the old-fashioned oats. You can use quick cooking oats in this recipe. If you don't do the step I'm going to show you next. But I think the old-fashioned oats have a nicer texture in the finished product. The quick oats to me seemed a little bit mealy. So I'm going to take just like half a cup of my oats, put them in a spice grinder. Could be you could do it in a blender, you can do it in a food processor. I'm just going to pulse it a little bit because I want some flowery texture. So you can see it's not really fine. I still have big bits of oats, but I have some mealy bits too. And that will help it stick to itself as we go along. Again, we have sesame seeds, 2 tablespoons. And this time, I need to get my other tray. Excuse me 1 second.
This granola bar is more like a Nature's Valley granola bar as opposed to a chewy granola bar.
Yeah.
For reference.
Yeah. But not as sweet as the,
right. Well, not as sweet as any commercial bar because they're always so sweet.
Yeah. Again, I'm using the unhulled sesame seeds for flavor so they won't burn. And I'm adding also chia seed, which I don't know if you're familiar with chia. It's a plant seed similar. It has a similar property to a flax seed where it reacts to moisture by a gelling action. So it has a nice little nutty flavor, kind of neutral. Adds a nice bit of crunch, but that gelling thing is really good for us in this case. You could use flax seeds instead, but it's 2 tablespoons of chia. And again, granulated sugar here, I'm just using unrefined granulated sugar, cane juice. Same reasons, crisping, and it'll help it hold together. Then we come to our nuts and seeds. This is a 1/4 cup of walnuts. And I want to give you a great tip for toasting nuts. Pecans, walnuts, not so much hazelnuts. Almonds you can do this way. And that is the microwave. Basically put them on a plate like that, put them in. And if you're nervous, I just happen to know that about a minute is right. But if you're nervous about it at all, you can just, excuse me 1 sec. If you're nervous about it at all, just do it in 20-second, 30-second increments. I can't tell you the number of times when I toast nuts in the oven that I've just gone off, forgotten them, and then you just have this burned mess, and it's so disheartening. So I've kind of reverted to this microwave method. And in the meantime, Claire, can we go over to the stove? Mm-hmm. I want to show you toasting pepita nuts. So these are pepitas, they're pumpkin seeds. These are organic ones for you local folks from Market Basket. They're very green, they're pretty flat, and they taste very raw. So they're better toasted before you use them, in my view, both for salads or in baking. So if you put them on, you probably can just do like a medium heat. I haven't done this on Claire's stove before, so I'm gonna just watch. Put them in a dry skillet. Just sprinkle them in there. Let's open this. And you can just, you could use a spoon if you want. You can just toss them, give it a second. And they're gonna start almost popping. They'll sound a little bit like popcorn. And they go from being very flat to being puffed up. They get nice and round and fat like a little hedgehog maybe. And they're much more delicious. Like even for salads and things like that, do this. And it takes just a second. Doesn't take much time at all. Also, sunflower seeds are really nice if you toast them before putting them in something like this. They too have that raw aspect that is the flavor, I think, is much improved by toasting. Turn this up a little bit, hurry it along. So I'm starting to get a little bit of color, but I'm not seeing too much puffing yet. Does anybody have any questions?
Suze, I feel like since we have about 9 minutes left, what is the featured flavor of this bar?
Oh, good answer. So the featured flavor is pumpkin and candy spice. And Claire, I think, let me just go get the candy spice here. I can show you guys this way. Can you see it?
Yeah.
So candy spice is our blend that's an ode to Sri Lanka, which is where we get quite a number of our direct source spices from a co-op, a farming co-op there. Oh, here we go. I don't know if you can hear it. It's just quietly cracking, and then there's, if you're watching it, it's like they're alive. They're kind of waking up and getting fatter.
Vanya, go ahead and ask your question if you'd like.
Okay, I have a question about salt in both the granola
Yeah.
and what you're about to do. Like, I have all this like flake salt, I have thick salt, thin salt. Does it make a difference? Can I use like the Maldon flaky salt in these things?
Of course. I would err on the side of using a tiny bit less to start, and then taste your raw material, you know, once you've got it mixed, taste it and see if you can, because the saltiness by volume and the salinity of different salt, it does vary from salt to salt. It's kind of a waste to use those in baking, unless you're not using them anyway. I mean, like Maldon salt is really kind of considered a finishing salt because it has a beautiful texture on your tongue. And it's kind of spendy. So people, I think, usually use that as more as a finishing salt than, you know, an everyday salt like a regular sea salt or kosher salt. But there's no reason you can't use them.
Great, thank you.
Not at all. So our seeds are in, everything's in. The one thing that we want to add is some nutmeg. And this is, again, one of those spices. And I'm gonna eyeball this. But we're going to add a bit of nutmeg here to complement nutmeg that's already in our sweetener. And the sweetener in this case is a jam that we've pre-made. That's very simple, so you could make that the day before or days before you make these. This is a microplane. I just have a very basic one. We sell a nice one for spices, specifically for spices at the shop. But they're readily available. They're wonderful for citrus zest, for hard cheeses, and for nutmeg. So again, this is an area where I would really encourage you, grate this over a bowl, a small bowl. It takes no time. You're just looking for a 1/4 teaspoon here just to, I mean, look how much I got just in that on a sharp grater. Wow.
Nutmeg,
So
just like cardamom, is super volatile. So that's the same thing. Like, save yourself from buying great, you know, pre-grated nutmeg. You'll just have so many tastier recipes.
And the nutmeg is something, if you keep the, you know, now that this one's sort of unopened, they keep for ages in a jar. And once it's grated like this, as long as it's in a sealed jar, it's one of the in that way, it's one of the longest lived spices. But once grated, it's fleeting. So do yourself a favor, like do a little extra, set it to the side, and just create a little experiment and just watch how the scent changes over time. And just to understand the power of a fresh spice. In this case, what we're going to do, we have melted coconut oil. So I just melted that. You can melt it on the stove. You can melt it. I usually just keep it in the jar. I don't scoop it out because it's kind of hard at room temperature. I just melt it in the jar. I did it in the microwave, I'll be honest. I'm just going to get a bowl that I used, the one that I used for the cherries. We've made this jam. This jam is super simple. It's canned pumpkin, which is just plain, not seasoned in any way, not already pre-spiced. I get an organic one. It's readily available at my grocery store, so it's just an easy thing to find. And it's an odd measure in the recipe. It's 10 tablespoons, which is approximately 2/3 cup, but it's not quite 2/3. So if you're using a 1/3 cup measure, go a little light on that. This little scoop is actually 2 tablespoons. So I'm going to do 5 of these. And the jam is just the pumpkin, some sugar, lemon juice that's cooked down. Was that 4? I think, there we go, 5. That's cooked down with lemon juice and sugar for about 15 to 17 minutes. And then you take it off the heat and you stir into the hot jam, you stir salt and spices. And the spices in this case are candy spice, which is, again, a very autumnal, it's like a pumpkin, you feel pumpkin pie, definitely. It makes a beautiful pumpkin pie. It has things like fennel. It's a cinnamon forward blend. So it's really nice seasonal blend. It's great with pumpkins and squashes, both in savory and sweet settings. And then we're going to use just 3 tablespoons of the coconut oil. And you want to just whisk this together. It doesn't have to be fully blended, but it just helps it, makes it easier to distribute if they're kind of combined. So you can see it's not fully combined. It takes a minute, but there it is. That, like that is fine. So I'm just gonna, that's my moisture for this recipe.
The candy spice is named after the region in Sri Lanka where we source most of the spices for that blend. And in Sri Lanka, in fact, those spices that we associate with baking and fall granola are used for things like fish curry and other things. So there's very different associations with those spices.
Those flavors.
In the world.
So, and it's really wonderful to remember that because we think of them as sweet spices, but those sweet aspects, they also have some peppery aspects, and they also have floral aspects, and how that sweetness can balance, you know, even something like a fish that you wouldn't think of putting cinnamon with, where it brings brightness and floral. It just brings this beautiful contrast to it, and it's cool to start thinking about spices that we kind of pigeonhole them, and they often work across the aisle. Let's use that metaphor. We're going to add 1 tablespoon of just warm tap water. And it's just like the granola. You're going to bring it all together. And you can see it's why I like this darn thing. It goes pretty darn quickly. So once you have this mixture made and we press it into the pan to sort of mold it, you're going to let it sit on the counter for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And that just helps some of the moisture transfer from the jam and the water that you put in and the oil into the oats and into the chia. So it kind of activates the gelling action of the chia a little bit, and it hydrates the oats. So that little rest. So what I usually do is mix it, and then I turn my oven on to preheat. I don't preheat my oven before, and then I just let it rest until the oven comes up to temperature, which is, you know, about 15 minutes. Can you see what I'm doing here? Basically, you're gonna, you know, just get it out into all the edges of the pan. And then you really want to press this down. It's not that you're pressing so hard. It's that you are compacting it. It's not like you're, you know, really leaning on it, but you're definitely compacting this, and this helps it hold together. It's a little tricky because the parchment paper is slippery, but it does work, and I find that kind of a stroke like that works really well. And make sure you go along your edges when you're done so that they're not just going to fall apart.
Show us on the overhead really quickly.
Okay.
You can see.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you, Claire. So the motion that I find most effective is kind of like this. If you were using a regular spatula, instead of an offset spatula, you would be kind of pushing. So you want it nice and even and pressed into the pan. Then I'm sort of speeding through this a little bit because I rambled on too much with the granola. I'm sorry.
Okay.
You're just going to bake this for about, you're going to start the oven at 350. And after 10 minutes, you're going to reduce the heat. So you start with a higher heat and then you reduce the heat to 325. When you take them out of the oven, you're going to just score. You're not going to cut all the way through because they'll start to break apart. You're going to take a sharp little knife and you're going to score how you want your bars to be. You're going to let them cool for a little while. It's in the recipe. And then you'll use these levers to pick them up and put them on a rack to cool fully. If you find when they've cooled fully that they're still not really crispy enough, you're going to bake them a second time. Just think of it like a biscotti, because what you're trying to do is, like I said, toast the grains, unify the flavors, and then you're also driving moisture out. And it doesn't hurt while you're baking these to open the oven door a couple of times. Just open it and close it. It lets steam that's coming off of these out of the oven. Can we go back to the main camera, Claire? So I wanted to show you what they look like when they're done, and they make a really nice snack with some sliced apple, a little cheddar cheese. And I cut these in squares rather than big bars because they're kind of nutrient dense. They're kind of, I don't know that you need a whole big bar, but it's completely up to you. The other thing you can do is, instead of cutting it at all, because cutting is a little bit fiddly, is just leave it whole, let it cool, and then break it into big chunks so that you have like a granola bark. And that's nice as well. And no stress, totally no stress. That's what I got.
Thank you, Susie.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions they want to ask live before we close up?
Oh, I know one thing I wanted to tell you guys is on the jam. The jam is really, it says it in the head note, but it's really true. You can put a tablespoon or two of that jam into like a vinaigrette and have kind of a pumpkin-y vinaigrette for a roasted root vegetable salad. You could use it as part of a glaze when you're roasting something like carrots or sweet potatoes in the oven. So any place you want to bring that sort of sweet, squashy kind of flavor in, you can use that jam, and it's also just good on toast.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
And that is, how would you store the bars?
I keep them, I will show you. I will show you. I keep them in a tin.
Good old fashioned cookie tin.
Yeah. And I put a little, a little paper in there and keep them in a tin. But you definitely want them airtight. You can use a zip bag, you can use a jar. You just want them airtight because they will attract moisture from the, from the atmosphere. Probably not a good idea to make them on a real humid day.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thank you, Susan, for a wonderful class.
Yeah, it's been great.
Oh, good. Thank you.
We're going to follow up with all these, with some more tips and links to some of the tools we mentioned that we offer at Curio. And you should have received the recipes already, but we'll just attach them one more time for you. And feel free to ping us with any further questions. We have 2 other classes coming up, one more in end of September and one in October. So stay tuned, keep opening our newsletters, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys.
All right, everyone have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Good night.
Thank you.
See ya.
you.
Hi, Lyndon.